Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you for making this opportunity possible, and thank Cody for having the show so that I could have this opportunity. Yeah, thank you, Cody.
Charles, thank you.
And we were talking before, and that's because Cody was it 10 years ago you were at CalArts?
Yeah.
And then I remember these brutal critique courses. They were really brutal. And, I mean, of all the classes that I've had, I remember those critiques for some reason. But then 10 years go by, and then Cody shows up in my studio to do a preparatory talk for this presentation. Then I was suddenly thrust back 10 years ago. I thought it was a CalArts again. Thought, we're in a brutal situation, and he left the studio sweating.
It's true. It's true.
I apologized when he was leaving. I'm sorry, Cody. I didn't mean to do that. Something came over me, but I'm glad to thank you for asking me to do this. But why?
I feel a strong connection to your work. I always have. I was telling Michael and Anna earlier today, I don't know if I ever told you this, that the reason I came to CalArts was because of you and to study with you. I'd been hearing about your work through some friends and reading some of the things that you had written, and it felt like I needed to be at CalArts to work with you. So I think just a continuation of the appreciation, of your work.
No, you didn't. You never told me that.
Yeah.
And yet you turned out to be quite a good artist. It turned out anyway. So.
Anyway.
This is a slow crowd.
Yeah.
I don't know. So we got our work cut out for us.
Perfect.
But we had a really good conversation yesterday, and so I developed a couple of questions, and they're just versions of what we talked about
Sure.
anyway. But and one of the things that came up in our conversation is that your work somehow addresses a kind of what I call the sort of a binary opposition between in time, and probably in space too, but this binary between static and dynamic time, contingent time, and what we call positivist time. So like the absolute time of the clock would be the positivist, and the let's say a kind of durational time, like the idea about time that John Cage had would be contingent. And you talked about the fact that you're somehow your focus or interest in time this way came from certain experiences in your life. And so before we go into the work, I was hoping you can sort of elaborate on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the origin of this work came from, a few kind of what felt like epic sort of life events, the death of my father, and then some illness, kind of serious health scares, fortunately on the other side of now. But I think through that experience, I was forced to try to reconcile this experience of contingency with this belief that I've had that time is sort of fixed, like an Einsteinian space-time, it's all written past and future. And they still feel really at odds. I think that's the origin of the work, but also the interest in the time that you mentioned. So, I think a lot of the work, it sort of unfolds in two ways, this representation of contingency and also this representation of time. And in certain works, I think there's an attempt to sort of flatten them. Like the piece behind me of the numbers were taken from this publication by the RAND Corporation. It's called A Million Random Digits, and it just was used in the 50s and 60s as a source of randomness for experimenters or cryptographers. I was interested in it as a source of something random, but fixed in print, and it's been reprinted. The same plates have been reprinted, all these years later. And also, in regards to the time, all these drawings are done with bleach, and I'm interested in. So the bleach is kind of always unstable, sort of always corrosive, and that also is a mark of the contingent in a way, that the image is always kind of unfolding, but it also captures the sense of time, and that the bleach itself literally imbues the work with a time. At some point, it's going to sort of disintegrate, or at least the places where the image are. So that's, I think, where where the time and contingency came from.
There's a long-term investigation philosophy about these two notions of time that I know that you know about, because we talked about it years ago at the CalArts. But it's unresolved in philosophy. They still exist as two poles.
The idea of time?
Yeah, two ideas of time. And so there hasn't been, it hasn't happened yet that these two opposing notions have synthesized into one. So that in many ways you're taking on that polarity, right? and that becomes an important issue for you because of your experiences in life, which might be a way of trying to figure out. It might be a way of addressing why you might want these two poles to come together, to synthesize. Yeah, and but in your work, my question really had to do with that. I mean, it was almost answering the question for you, but my question had to do with did you regard this as a kind of formidable issue? Because of it's not as simple as taking black and white and coming up with gray. Mm-hmm. Is that a deeply rooted philosophical, psychological, emotional set of ideas that ultimately drives the work?
Yeah, I mean, time itself was the subject of 2 exhibitions ago, and I also was very interested in, the show, I think, really questioned the idea of what is a now. How can we say that your now is the now that I consider, that it's not granular, and that it's sort of chunking along. It's much more fluid. And so, yeah, I think I do think it's essential, core in a way, and also. Right, with the health scares, I think that's, a part of it. With the death of my dad, it also made its effect, I think, even more palpable for me.
Yes, so that there's living in the space of that polarity, then that's this sort of emotional as well as critical function for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think that's fair.
So I was wondering if you could go further in that, because in the various pieces you're dealing with that issue of static and dynamic time, and you're approaching it. You talked about the bleach troping this idea of change, mm-hmm. and contingency, and then also the numbers, it can, in fact, in the case of the piece behind you. What's the name of this work?
This is Almost
Yeah, almost, yeah.
Almost.
Yeah. So that's a good example of what I was asking about, bringing together the polarities, because you recognize that a random generated sequence of numbers operate in a fixed space.
Mm-hmm.
So could you go through some of the other pieces and then talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think another place where time is involved and compressed are in these other panel pieces, where you have this. There are two layers. The top layer is a silkscreen with ballpoint pen ink, and the bottom layer is toner from a toner transfer process. The image that's silkscreened is produced from the cellular automata, which I panicked about in our conversation on Friday, and I have some more information.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you more about that.
Okay. But this pattern produced by the cellular automata is, for me, also a representation of time, in that this sort of blip that produces this diagonal line is this sort of like movement through fixed time. I think maybe to your point, where time is examined maybe more critically is in the bleach material. Here I was interested in it as like an image that sort of absorbs that purpose, this sort of moving through time, and it's layered on top of of different pieces. Like in this piece over here with the framed piece with the ballpoint pen ink over the photograph. The photograph is actually the underside of my sheet pans in the kitchen. I was doing dishes one day and discovered the mark and thought it was this really beautiful, like it was beautiful as a mark of chance. And then this line that goes over the top is an abstraction of this line. So it's a sort of extension of this movement, but outside of the kind of the production of this image, of this pattern. You can't know this now because we're just looking at the silkscreen of it, but when the image is made through this cellular automata program, you actually see the line being generated. So it does, it is produced in time because it's a generational process.
It's important. There are a couple of reasons, because to get deeper into these sort of strategies, these systems, we're talking about the systems aspect of your work, because there's the issue of access to them,
right?
Which we can talk to, but I think it was illuminating for me to find out what you meant by random generation, number of generation, or pattern generation that are actually random. So the idea is that a computer is fed an algorithm of random numbers, and that this algorithm draws successive horizontal lines. Am I right?
Yeah. So the cellular automata is a really simple algorithm. It's basically on the premise if you have a grid of black or white squares, essentially, you have an algorithm that takes effect on that top line of grid that produces the next line. So it's generational. And my interest in cellular automata in the abstract, I've been interested in it for many years, is that it's the simplest algorithm that in some instances can produce something random or essentially almost random. Rule 30, for instance, of the cellular automata. And then even more extreme is something like Rule 110, which is actually considered Turing complete. It's a universal computer, essentially. And this is the part when we were talking that I did not remember accurately. But basically, the pattern that's produced through this algorithm you can essentially apply a program to it, and that's what would make it random or make it quote unquote Turing complete. This is a totally different category. It's Rule 53, and my interest in it was purely that it's just this sort of mark of a straight, kind of execution of time.
So what does that mean for you to see this diagonal as a consequence of the propagation of random numbers?
Well, this isn't random in this case. They're not random. It's no matter sort of what original condition you give it, you would still get this diagonal line. So I think that was my interest in this pattern, was that it is the opposite of random. It sort of points at this idea of space-time as like a fixed fabric that we sort of move through. Other programs like Rule 30, for instance, is actually the image that's produced from it is actually used as a random number generator. So it has like varying levels of complexity. But I think for this work, it was used to produce this image of this this sort of unchanging line that's layered, literally over some of the other works, and then.
How is that important in terms of your relationship to time?
Well, in that it's this representation of, sort of not being able to change. You're just moving through time. So it's fixed with each generation. You don't deviate. It's just this sort of straight line, like a linear sort of movement through time. Compared, of course, with something like the bleach drawings, where it is unfixed. The time is activated in a really different way, I think, in those works. Here, it's an image that sort of serves that function for me. The bleach drawings, I think, do activate the work. In multiple ways. I mean, the image is different 5 years from now, and 10 years from now, the image will still continue to change. And not knowing what that image looks like is, in a way, a contingency.
Yeah, before we go more deeply into the bleach drawings, I want you to talk about how your relationship and use of materials contribute to this general notion of time.
Yeah, so on the bleach, I don't know if you guys have a chance. I'm sorry, the ballpoint penning is what I meant. I'm pointing at ballpoint penning, sorry. Is a really strange material to work with. So they're drained from big round stick pens, like tens of thousands of them, and it takes a really long time.
So so you stood there or sat there and squeezed out the ink from 10,000 ballpoint pens?
Yeah, it was horrible. It's like you have to dress up because it goes everywhere, and you have pliers and carpal tunnel, and
Does it dry quickly? Or?
No, it takes a really long time to dry. Yeah, like about 6 weeks. And they're silk screened, but it's very viscous. It doesn't pull through the screen very easily, and so what happens is you can see parts, especially on this one, where it pools and sort of forms its own image, outside of the template of the silkscreen, and also just because it takes so long to dry, it also, it changes. So another interest in ballpoint pen ink is it's a really dynamic surface. So it changes with the light. It changes with what's standing in front of them. So I think in that way there's something contingent about it. One of the things we spoke about on Friday was, I mentioned, like, in a way, the most ideal work that could be conceived for this sort of examination of contingency would be a work that's formed anew with every viewing, and then sort of disappears and then appears again as some new sort of contingent piece. And I haven't figured out how to do that yet. It sort of seems impossible, but there have been attempts at approximating that, and I think the sort of conditional quality of viewing the works with the ballpoint pen ink is one way, I think, of approaching that. I think the bleach, obviously we talked about its how I feel about its, or think about its contingent properties. I think that's a big part of it. This piece here, these sort of holes that are formed in the negative space of the print were produced by accident, just in pulling the print, which is another, in a way, another kind of contingency.
Yeah, so I'm going back to this model that I had, that the work in general is in a dialogue there's a dialogue between these two constructs of time that you've managed to, and I'm making the claim that it's a difficult one to achieve, but you managed to use the vehicle of art to create a space where these two things can be in dialogue. So what I'm pointing to is that it seems that that's one aspect, one we'll call technical operation in the work is using indeterminate or contingent materials, like let's say the ink or the bleach, and then the other part of that is that we can sort of that shows something that's fixed and standard, like speaking about Rule 52? Yeah. 53. Yeah, 53. So that there are these two things that are in dialogue in the work, and a motivating factor or a satisfying factor that can be considered is that, in one way or another, it addresses a set of possibilities that might be looked at in terms of dealing with things in the world. That like your own encounter that, and within the space of your own life, you found that fixed time and contingent time sort of butted up against each other, and that at a certain point or in a certain way, it's calling on you to try to make sense of it. And so that the work of art becomes a way of reframing what would be called life experience within the work of art, and try to find a space where you can make sense of it. And so what I'm suggesting is that this deliberate choice of using fixed and contingent tropes and forming a discourse or dialogue between them is practically the accomplishment of the work. Would you agree with that kind of assessment?
Thank you. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it still seems to me like something, kind of impossible to resolve. I'm sure I'm just not thinking, maybe it's an issue of terms for me in terms of this, this incompatibility between, the experience of contingency and a belief in its impossibility. Yeah.
Yeah, which raises my Cal Arts question.
Oh boy.
Relative to, let me pull back and say that these considerations that we're talking about with respect to chance and determinacy are vital operations in the work, but you don't think about those things when you're looking at it. Right?
Yeah.
And so essentially what I want to continue our conversation about what, how is, this speaks to a certain attitude about a work of art and its ability to deal with such questions. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to, I'd like to continue our conversation we had about that, about how there may be ways that you're looking at how art functions that make it unnecessary to literalize or illustrate these critical points that we're talking about with respect to time.
Yeah. Yeah, I gave this a lot of thought after our talk on Friday, actually. I think I used to believe that the role of the artist in some way was just to try to narrow the range of interpretation. That you could sort of counter the subjectivity of a viewer if you were just focused enough or precise enough, conceptually within the work. And tried, and I think the work definitely has loosened up in that regard. That grip on my work has loosened, and I think at some point there, at least in my experience of trying to accomplish this, at some point there is a limit to what can be contained and articulated within a work, which is probably sacrilege for you to hear. But I really struggled with it at CalArts, and at some point even considered dropping out and trying something like philosophy, because the project I was working on there was about trying to give form through the space of an exhibition to paradox, and I'm not sure in the end that I was successful in doing that, and I sort of keep trying over and over again, and I think it's an open question for me.
I want to get back into that, but being at this place, what then do you think the type of experience that is ultimately being produced? So for example, in order to get invested in this critical notion of time, mm-hmm. you have to know what's going on in the work,
right,
as a viewer. And so if you don't have access to that, then the work is creating another kind of experience. I think linked, but it's another kind of experience, and something that's valuable, rather than say that, well, works of art fail at articulating conceptual issues. Rather than that, it may be simply a matter that you have another idea about what a work of art should be done, should or can do.
Yeah.
Because if you wanted to, you could have taken the old tired conceptual art approach. I said old and tired, so give me a break. Right? So which would use the visuality as documentary, as a documentary language.
Sure.
So that there's a much more sort of literal entry into an abstract idea. That's the open-endedness of conceptual art, because the idea is abstract. But you for a number of reasons you don't do that. You don't. That's not the way that's not what you believe art for yourself should function. So it's sort of like you encounter this really compelling conceptual issue, and you're an artist and you want to deal with that in your work. But in order to deal with the issue on a particular level, like a philosopher, you'd have to make art in a way that you don't want to make. So then you sort of then resolve that, of course, by saying, fuck you, I'm going to do it this way anyway, right? But the thing is that I know that there is a kind of experience that you think is being produced by this. It's just not an open-ended, it can mean anything to anybody situation.
You're saying it can mean anything. Yeah. Well, that's not the objective. I think, I do still believe that, that within a conceptual practice, you can still be about a currency of ideas, and maybe it's not systems-based. Maybe material choices, become more cryptic, in terms of pointing at those things. But I am definitely still committed to a project that's about ideas. I think it's also, for me, I was thinking about contingency, like real contingency, like something unfathomable, and how how is that represented? You know, I think if you take a systems-based approach, you have eliminated the capacity for real contingency because you've put parameters around it. The parameters.
But I disagree with that.
I know. Well, I was going to say, I think in your argument, there's the claim that the parameters sort of outline the logic. They set up the logic for understanding the work. But
my idea is that the parameters reveal their failure.
Yeah.
So if they can textualize anything, it shapes and focuses the moment of failure that I think that is underscored in your work. I'm not using failure as a as a critical observation, but sorry to interrupt you. I just felt compelled to defend myself.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I don't know what the answer is, in terms of how that's articulated, how it's communicated. I mean, I think, in my mind, keeps sort of hammering at this problem of how does one articulate a paradox, and it keeps not getting there. But I am invested in the project. I think you're right to point out that the work has loosened up. The constraints of the work definitely have loosened up. But it also feels like it's all the same thing in a way.
So we took what I thought you were successfully doing. I'm not sure if you agree with that, but that by virtue of allowing sort of a kind of aesthetic relationship to the object, which the conceptualists pretty much didn't pay much attention to. That the kind of intellectual rigor minimized that issue, particularly in the use of materials. That quite limited use of materials, conceptualism got involved in. That interesting that you found an aesthetic in the materials that you use. Mm-hmm. It seems that, for example, the quality of the ballpoint ink, that was interesting to you. And it has an aesthetic function on the level of the behavior of the ink and what it produces visually. That you found, so if I can extrapolate from that to say that there are a series of behaviors that you seem to go through in making these works that can be under the radar, but wind up being very important, that manifest a certain and become meaningful as an aesthetic.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I also think that there's information in the material choices that the bleach, does articulate a certain idea of time. If you allow yourself to.
Yeah, but my point is that you're not going to be thinking about that when you look at the work.
You don't think so?
No, not as the concept of time. I mean, you can look at the contingency of the material, but how does that relate to this issue of the polarity that we were talking about?
Yeah.
So in that way, it hasn't conceptualized around that idea. But and this is because I don't want to say that because it might appear, but I don't want to give the idea that by having this relationship to process and materials, that you join the abstract expressionists. Yep. So I'm not saying that at all. What I'm suggesting is that it becomes a series of material consequences and visual consequences of the application of these terms That is that if you, on the one hand, are talking about contingency, and on the other hand, you're talking about determinacy, and you're finding tropes of them in materials and practices of the numbers, that you're bringing those two things together in a work of art, and the effect that they have after coming together in a work is that they produce a visual space that otherwise probably you would not have imagined in a million years. It's a pure, and that has a certain conceptual component to it. That it is tossing these two, entering the space of the sublime with respect to these two things, and being open to what might be produced out of that space, and that's a certain kind of open-endedness that allows this sort of liberal relationship with the work. There's less need, because of what happens as a function of that behavior, less need to turn these pieces into more literal translations of certain conceptual ideas and propositions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think the terms of production, of the actual literal production, are aesthetic. I mean, the background images for the panel pieces are produced with a computer program that I wrote that extrudes a 2D image and turns it into a 3D, and I basically snapped a photo, the most pleasing version, of the background. So, yeah.
Can I have one of the unpleasing ones instead? Send it to me.
Absolutely. So, I mean, and with this piece, the ballpoint pen over the photo here, it's a silkscreen process. So I pulled 4 prints and I chose the one that I liked, the best. So yeah, I think I agree on those terms. Makes sense. Yeah.
This is since it looks like I won the argument.